We began this series in a Canadian citizenship court, and this is where we will end it, at the place where people become citizens of the nation called Canada. This is because it was only during the period covered in this last program, the 1860s to the mid-1880s, that Canada took a major step towards nationhood and subsequently united from sea to sea, à mari usque ad mare. But as we've seen throughout all of our Origins programs, Canadian history is intimately bound up with the history of many other parts of the world, in particular with the history of the United States. In fact, in order to understand how Canada became a nation, we have first to know something of the agonies the American nation was going through in the early 1860s.
Between 1861 and 1865, the United States was torn in half as 3 million Americans took to the battlefield in one of the most devastating civil wars the world has ever seen. One of the underlying causes of the conflict was this plant, cotton. By the mid-1800s, the economy of the southern states was almost entirely dependent on the cultivation of huge quantities of cotton, which made up more than 2/3 of the total United States exports. But during this period, the production of cotton required an enormous amount of manpower and depended on the labor of no fewer than 3.5 million black slaves in the South. In the northern states, the situation was quite different. Here, a variety of industries were already taking hold. The economy in general was much more diversified. So the North could afford to dispense with slave labor and piously condemn the practice. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president, largely by northern voters, he tried to prevent the expansion of slavery in the South. This raised the whole question of whether the federal government had the right to dictate the internal affairs of individual states. The Southerners claimed that it did not. And in 1861, 11 Southern states seceded from the Union to form the Confederate States of America. But Lincoln was determined to keep the country together, and soon the blue-coated soldiers of the Union Army in the North were at war with the Confederate graycoats in the South. The carnage that resulted cost hundreds of thousands of lives. But the very scale and intensity of this conflict entailed the building up of huge and very efficient fighting forces by both sides. By the time the North had prevailed in 1865 and the United States was intact once more, America possessed one of the most powerful armies on earth. The implications of this military buildup were not lost on the inhabitants of British North America. The U.S. had already attempted to invade these colonies in 1775 and then again in 1812. And as recently as 1846, the Americans had threatened to take over the northwest coast. But now, in the 1860s, they were in a stronger position than ever to invade their northern neighbors, and they were certainly in the mood to do so. Again, this was partly because of cotton. Since the British textile mills were by far the largest consumers of American cotton, Britain's rulers tended to favor the southern cotton producers during the Civil War. They allowed the South to have warships built in Britain, and even turned a blind eye when Confederate troops carried out a raid on the northern states from Canadian soil. And although many Canadians sympathized with the North and had in fact provided a refuge for thousands of runaway southern slaves before the hostilities began, It was the general pro-Confederate stance of the British that the Americans remembered. So when the war ended, it seemed more than likely that the United States would decide to strike back at Britain by invading her North American colonies. After all, the Americans had now filled in almost all the blank spaces on the map south of the border. The logical next step was to fill in the largely blank area to the north, which still only consisted of a very loose assembly of half a dozen quite separate colonies, with a total population of a little over 3 million, as compared with a daunting 35 million people in an America which was once again united and now in possession of a great army. Britain was no longer willing or able to defend her colonies against such a juggernaut. This time, if the various disconnected entities which made up British North America were to avoid being absorbed by the United States, they would have to become united themselves.
The American Civil War was the major external reason for the British North American colonies to unite. But even before that conflict had begun, a whole series of internal pressures were building up that made some sort of Canadian union inevitable.
If cotton was America's single most significant crop in the mid-1800s, the Canadian equivalent was wheat. By this period, the export of grain and flour had joined lumber as British North America's chief source of import revenue. Again, Britain was not only its largest customer, but since the end of the Napoleonic Wars, she had also made this trade particularly profitable for Canada by allowing these commodities to enter British ports almost completely duty-free. This naturally gave an enormous boost to the British North American economy. Unhappily for Canada, in the mid-1840s, Britain switched to a free trade policy, which put an end to this preferential treatment. The Canadians now felt that their economy was being cut adrift from the mother country. It seemed that their only hope of survival was to improve their trading position on this continent. But that meant meeting the strong commercial challenge of the Americans. And to do that, the British North American provinces would have to close ranks and form a united front. Here was an important financial incentive for colonial union, but there was also a strong political motivation. By the middle of the century, there were serious government problems in the United Province of Canada. This was essentially because of Lord Durham, whose scheme to assimilate the French Canadians had backfired. By recommending the merger of Upper and Lower Canada into one province, he had hoped that French Canada would eventually disappear, swallowed up in an English-speaking majority. But Durham's second major recommendation, responsible government, had canceled out the first one. This was because its net effect had been to increase the political power of the French Canadians, thereby causing the so-called United Province of Canada to continue to be split into a mainly French Canada East and a largely English Canada West. The two cultures were now more polarized than ever. This situation was complicated by the presence of two main political groups in both halves of the province: the Conservatives or Tories and the Liberals or Reformers. The trouble was the relative strengths of these two groups in English and French Canada were almost mirror images of one another, with the Reformers dominating Canada West and the Tories prevailing in Canada East. In order for the relatively weak English Tory party to get anywhere, it was forced to ally itself with the strong French Tory group. During the 1850s, two outstanding leaders of this alliance emerged: John A. Macdonald and George Etienne Cartier. But the fundamental political imbalance of the two Canadas made things increasingly difficult for the Macdonald-Cartier partnership. By the early 1860s, government had reached an almost complete deadlock. So, in addition to the military and economic pressures, there was now an urgent political pressure to find some new form of union for the two Canadas, and ideally for all of British North America. The opportunity came in 1864, when the leaders of the maritime provinces arranged to meet at Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, to discuss a union of their own region. Macdonald, Cartier, and others hastened to attend this maritime meeting. And after a series of such conferences, agreement was finally reached to form a confederation consisting initially of 4 provinces: Canada West, renamed Ontario; Canada East, reverting to its old name of Quebec; New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. In due course, the British Parliament passed the British North America Act, and Queen Victoria proclaimed the birth of a new federal state on July the 1st, 1867, the Dominion of Canada.
Confederation was a great moment in the history of our country. But in 1867, we were still not completely independent. We continued to be part of the British Empire. And to begin with, of course, Confederation only involved a fraction of the Canada we know today. Newfoundland and Prince Edward Island at one extreme of this continent and British Columbia at the other were still outside the new federation, as was the whole of the Northwest. And it was to this huge Northwest region that the new Dominion first turned its attention. Once again, this was largely because of developments in the United States.
The Wild West. Cowboys and Indians. This classic period of American history, when the white man battled the Indian for control of the Great Plains, began in earnest in the late 1860s at the very moment Canada was achieving Confederation. But the Great Plains take no account of political borders, and the settlers who were migrating to the American West also threatened to fill the vast vacuum of Canada's West. While this was going on, in the year of Confederation itself, 1867, the United States acquired yet another gigantic chunk of this continent that increased its territory by nearly 20%. This was Alaska, which the Russians agreed to sell to the United States for $7 million. The Canadians now had Americans to the south of them and Americans to the north of them. If they didn't act fast, they would lose the West altogether. So now it was the Dominion's turn to do some buying of its own. All the land from the Great Lakes to the Rockies was still loosely controlled by the Hudson's Bay Company. But Britain was no longer willing to continue the fur trading monopoly of that great commercial empire. And in 1869, the Canadian government was able to buy virtually all of the bay's enormous domain for a fraction of what the Americans had paid for Alaska. This whole area was then given the official title the Northwest Territories. But this land transfer had taken place without the slightest regard for the people who lived there. Not only such native groups as the Cree, the Assiniboine, and the Blackfoot, but also the 12,000 inhabitants of the Red River Colony. Those who had most to lose at Red River were the nearly 6,000 French Catholic Métis. The incorporation of their homeland into the new Dominion as part of the Northwest Territories was an obvious threat to the Métis' traditional way of life. The Métis feared, quite rightly, that hordes of English Protestant settlers from the east would now flood into the region, seizing their land and dashing their hopes of maintaining their French Catholic community in the west. Under their leader, Louis Riel, the Métis captured Fort Garry, the Hudson's Bay Company trading post at Red River, and set up a provisional government. This forced Prime Minister MacDonald into recognizing Red River as a small but full-fledged province, which would be distinct from the rest of the Northwest Territories, with guarantees for Métis land and continuation of their traditional French Catholic rights. Thanks to Riel, the Dominion now had a fifth province, which was given an Indian name, meaning Spirit Strait, or Lake of the Prairies, Manitoba. The next step for Canada was expansion to the Pacific coast. But the BC gold rush that had begun in the 1850s was now over, and most of the 10,000 or so white inhabitants of the region saw the economic advantages of joining Confederation, especially when Macdonald threw in a promise to complete a transcontinental railway linking British Columbia with eastern Canada within the next dozen years. So in 1871, Canada gained a sixth province. At the other end of the nation, on the Atlantic coast, Newfoundland continued to abstain from Confederation. But Prince Edward Island finally agreed to join in 1873. The Dominion of Canada now numbered 7 provinces plus the Northwest Territories, and truly extended from sea to sea.
In the space of only 6 years, between 1867 and 1873, the Dominion of Canada grew to nearly 8 times the size it had been at Confederation. But this astonishing rate of expansion also meant that the Dominion was spreading itself very thin. Getting this country together was one thing, keeping it together was another.
If the most vivid symbol of the United States is the Wild West, then the Canadian equivalent is exactly the opposite. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the very personification of law and order. In fact, the reason the Mounties were created in the first place was to make quite sure that Canada's West did not become wild, which was a very real possibility in the early 1870s. The Red River problems of 1869 had been resolved by the establishment of the tiny province of Manitoba, which soon led to the arrival of many settlers, both from eastern Canada and from Europe. These included several thousand German-speaking Mennonite farmers from the Russian Empire. All of this took place in an orderly fashion. But meanwhile, the remainder of the Northwest, corresponding to today's Saskatchewan and Alberta, was in a state of total disorder. This was because of the desperate plight of the Plains Indians, who were being destroyed by 3 scourges imported from south of the border: an epidemic of smallpox, a plague of American sharpshooters who were systematically exterminating the buffalo, and a rash of American whiskey traders who were debauching tribe after tribe. If this region were ever to be fit for settlement, the Canadian government had to restore order as firmly as possible. But to station a regular army here risked antagonizing both the United States and the native peoples. Somehow a fighting force had to be created, which would be neither perceived as a military threat by the Americans, nor associated with the dreaded blue-coated U.S. cavalry by the Indians. In 1873, Sir John A. Macdonald came up with an ingenious solution: the Mounties. A cross between a cavalry regiment and a constabulary, sporting British red in deliberate contrast to American blue, and diplomatically dubbed the Northwest Mounted Police. The result exceeded all expectations. In very short order, a few hundred Mounties managed not only to rid the Canadian Northwest of the American desperados and whiskey peddlers, but they also succeeded in reassuring the Indians as well. Soon, the region seemed safe for settlement for a growing number of pioneer farmers from the east. But in the early 1880s, there was more trouble. For the second time, the Métis were up in arms. They had won their struggle for provincial status in Manitoba, but so many Ontario farmers had crowded into the new province that most of the Métis had felt obliged to move further and further west in order to preserve their French Catholic culture and their free-ranging way of life. Many of these Métis settled in what is now Saskatchewan, in communities such as the village of Batoche. But with the pacification of this area by the Mounties, Anglo-Canadian farmers were following the Métis here too. Once more, these half-French, half-Indian buffalo hunters found themselves struggling for self-government and equitable land rights. And once again, just as they had done in 1869, they elected as their leader Louis Riel. In the spring of 1885, Riel proclaimed a provisional government, not of Manitoba this time, but of the Saskatchewan. He then ordered the Northwest Mounted Police to leave the country or face extermination. Now, it was a full-scale rebellion, and even the redoubtable Mounties could not stem the tide. At the same time, many of the Western native peoples were angry with the Canadian government for not respecting their land rights in the region. And some of the Cree Indians, encouraged by the early success of the Métis, also began to rebel, attacking a number of English-Canadian settlements in Saskatchewan. With increasing numbers of Plains Indians joining in this Northwest Rebellion, and the Mounties hopelessly outnumbered, it looked as if the Dominion of Canada might lose the West after all.
The story of how Canada solved the crisis created by the Northwest Rebellion brings us to the last act in our history of this country, which we are ending in the fateful year of 1885. Because this was the year in which two epic events took place in Canada, one a tragedy, the other a triumph, but both intimately related to one another.
Craigellachie, in the heart of the mountains of British Columbia, November the 7th, 1885. The Canadian Pacific Railway is about to be completed. The fulfillment of Sir John A. Macdonald's promise to build a railroad from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Regina, Saskatchewan, November the 16th, 1885. Louis Riel is about to be hanged. The end of a dream of self-government for the Métis. It is extremely unlikely that either of these events could have taken place without the other. For by an extraordinary historical coincidence, just at the very moment the Northwest Rebellion was on the point of breaking up the West, the Canadian Pacific Railway Company was on the point of going bankrupt. The CPR had been formed in 1881 to make good Macdonald's pledge of building a transcontinental railroad. And over the next 4 years, the company had truly worked wonders, constructing more than 3,000 kilometers of railway track over some of the most forbidding terrain anywhere in the world, only to come slap up against the almost impenetrable barrier of the Rockies and the Selkirks. These horrendous obstacles stretched the resources of 19th century technology to the limit. Huge quantities of nitroglycerin were used to blast a way through thousands of tons of rock. Some of the highest and longest trestle bridges ever erected were strung across mountain gorges and rivers. 30,000 men toiled on the CPR, setting down 1,600 railway ties for every kilometer of the way from Montreal to the Pacific Ocean, then nailing the steel rails to these ties with 30 million iron spikes. But all this was costing hundreds of millions of dollars. Finally, in the spring of 1885, the Canadian Parliament felt it could no longer go on pouring money into this ruinously expensive project. The work came to a standstill. It was then that the Northwest Rebellion broke out, and the government realized that the only way to put down the revolt was to dispatch a strong military force from eastern Canada all the way to Regina as quickly as possible. Suddenly, the CPR became of paramount importance. Within a few weeks, over 5,000 men had been transported to Saskatchewan. In spite of the valiant fight put up by the Métis, they were soon overwhelmed at the Battle of Batoche. On November the 16th, 1885, Louis Riel was executed. The Métis were crushed, and Canada was to be divided for many years to come over the tragic Riel affair, with the French claiming him as their martyr and hero, and the English condemning him as a fanatic and a traitor. But meanwhile, the CPR had amply justified its existence, and its funding was renewed, enabling the railroad to be completed just 9 days before the death of Riel, with its eastern and western sections meeting here at Craigellachie. This is a reenactment of that triumphant moment when Donald Smith, one of the senior directors of the company, had the honor of driving the last spike of all. The spike is now being started into the railway tie. They pause for a photograph. Just as happened 100 years ago, Donald Smith has mishit the spike. He's going to try again. The last spike has been driven at 9:22 a.m. on the 7th of November, 1885. The nation has been united by a ribbon of steel.